Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast with your host, Frank Conway, connecting brilliant minds in economics and finance.
In this week's episode of the Economic Rockstar Podcast, I speak with Dr. Brian Mills, Assistant Professor at the University of Florida. We talk about Brian's research interests in sport economics, particularly in the labour market for umpires and players. Brian also shares with us how improvements in technology has changed the game in baseball, where umpires have called for more strikes. Brian also mentions his free new course called Exploring Pitch Data with OR over at datacomp.com and explains what OR is and how this open source statistical program can be used to analyze your data. Check out the show notes for all the links, resources and books mentioned by Brian at economicrockstar.com/Brian Mills.
Never miss an episode of the Economic Rockstar Podcast. Visit economicrockstar.com, submit your name and email, and you will get each episode straight to your inbox.
Economics is the study of how to get the most out of life. It's the idea that we have limited time on this earth and we should use it wisely, and doing one thing means not being able to do another. And economics in many ways is the study of what those decisions imply for our outcomes, our well-being, and how we interact with each other when we make those decisions, whether it's in the marketplace for potatoes or whether it's in the marketplace for marriage, in the case of the differences in the sex ratios. Money doesn't make us happy. What makes us happy is those deeper and more abiding sources of satisfaction, such as respect and friendship and love. And I think that's, in some ways it's a cliche. You can't really argue with it, but actually applying it as Smith does to a wide range of behavior, from how you behaved with your relatives, with your friends, with your coworkers, which is what I try to do in my book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. I think that's what makes it an interesting way to think about things. He also understands that we self-deceive, that we have trouble looking at ourselves as we really are, and we have a desire to see ourselves as lovely even when we aren't. So we don't look at ourselves so honestly. And Smith was very aware of that and warned us to be conscious of the fact that we are maybe not exactly who we think we are.
In this week's episode of the Economic Rockstar Podcast, I speak with Russ Roberts, founder and host of the EconTalk podcast and research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. We talk about Adam Smith and how the application of Smith's philosophical and economic thinking can change our life. We also discuss market forces, the invisible hand, and prices. Russ also explains what Smith describes as the impartial spectator and the power of our conscience, as well as Adam Smith's advice on how to be happy. You can check out all the links, resources and books mentioned by Russ at economicrockstar.com/Russ Roberts.
Hi, Frank Conway here, and you're listening to the Economic Rockstar Podcast. I am so honoured to have Russ Roberts join me today. Hi Russ, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
Russ Roberts is Associate Editor, Founder and host of the popular and much-loved podcast EconTalk, and founding advisory board member of the Library of Economics and Liberty. Russ is the John and Jean Nault Research Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. His two rap videos on the ideas of John Maynard Keynes and F.A. Hayek, created with filmmaker John Papola, have more than 8 million views on YouTube. Russ's latest book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, An Unexpected Guide to Human Nature and Happiness, takes the lessons from Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments and applies them to modern life. Russ is also the author of 3 economic novels teaching economic lessons and ideas through fiction: The Price of Everything, The Invisible Heart, and The Choice, a fable of free trade and protectionism. Russ blogs at cafehayek.com and archives his work at russroberts.info. A 3-time Teacher of the Year, Russ has taught at George Mason, Washington University in St. Louis, and the University of Rochester, Stanford University, and the University of California. He earned his PhD from the University of Chicago and his undergrad degree in economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Russ, as I mentioned, you are the host and founder of the EconTalk podcast. And a lot of people question your views in terms of your liberal leanings toward society and, I suppose, the economy. But what I want to get from this interview, if you don't mind, is to talk about Adam Smith. And I think you have this personal love and connection with Adam Smith. I'd love to find out firstly, who is Adam Smith and where is that connection coming from?
Well, it's interesting that you called me a liberal. I'm a classical liberal, like Adam Smith. The term liberal in Europe today and in America a long time ago, but not so much today, was associated with the idea of limited government and a larger sphere of responsibility for individuals. And that was Smith's overarching philosophy as well, although, of course, in his time, policy issues are very different and the role of the government was very different. But Smith was an 18th century economist. His first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, came out in 1759, and his second book, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776. And they were both very acclaimed in their time, but The Wealth of Nations has had by far the biggest impact. He was not the first economist, but in many ways, he was the first influential economist, the first influential, I would say, social scientist. He was interested in much more than what people would call economics today, which I think is a good thing that he was. He was interested in a very broad range of human behavior, way beyond the stock market or GDP or interest rates. And he put forth all kinds of interesting information, ideas, stories, historical evidence, metaphors for people to understand how the economy worked and how human beings interact with each other.
At the time of Smith's whole thought process and his philosophies, this was in Scotland during the Enlightenment period. And how would that have influenced, or how had he contributed to that period of time?
Well, the thing that interests me the most is that his friends were people like David Hume, Adam Ferguson, and others who were Scottish, and there was all kinds of currents of intellectual thought merging and emerging at the time. But I think the single most important one that's relevant for us today is the idea of emergent order. The idea that there are some things, as Adam Ferguson, his fellow countryman, said, things that are the result of human action, but not human design. That is, there are things that people do without a plan or intending an outcome, yet those things produce that outcome. And Smith and Hume and Ferguson and others of his day were very interested in those kind of phenomenon. We now call those spontaneous order, emergent order, complexity. There's a whole bunch of places where these ideas come together in economics, in biology. So if you think about say in our human lives, something very, very mundane, the level of noise in a restaurant. It's clearly created by human beings talking, and yet no one person wants it to be, say, loud and noisy, but it is loud and noisy. And if you try to talk more quietly, you'll find the person across from you can't hear you, so you tend to talk loudly. And so there's in certain kinds of restaurants where there are a lot of seats and it's crowded. It's noisy. Even though everyone in the room might want it to be a little quieter, no one person can achieve that. And the level of noise that is achieved is no one person's design. Similarly, traffic in a major American and many world cities, say between 5 and 8 or 5 and 9, 6 and 9 in the morning, what we call rush hour, you go slowly. It's no one's decision to have slow transportation in the morning by car. On the streets of Washington, D.C., say, near where I live. And yet that's what happens every single day. It is the result of human beings getting in each other's way, but no one person, in fact, no one wants it that way. So those are negative examples of emergent order. Some positive examples would be a response to a shortage of something. The price goes up. Some people are encouraged to stop consuming the good. Producers are encouraged to start producing it. And all of a sudden you have a solution to a problem that nobody designed. An example that's happened historically in recent years in the United States is the price of energy has gotten much, much lower due to the fracking revolution. And there was no top-down decision. There were a lot of people who wanted us to have lower carbon choices for energy. There are a lot of people who would have liked prices of energy to be less than they were. Nobody designed that. It just happened. And that was a good thing mostly. So these phenomena that are complex, what's interesting about them, what Smith understood and what people have studied for the century since intervening in them often leads to unintended consequences. You have to intervene carefully, and it's not straightforward to change them, which is hard for us to accept as human beings.
When you mentioned spontaneous order, straight away I thought of Hayek and his work on spontaneous order. I haven't come across this before in Principles of Economics or Micro Foundations of Economics. So have we lost this connection between what Adam Smith has discussed about how a market is created as such, and then it's like the Austrians who picked up on this side of economic theory, or is this just something that we have missed out on in terms of just analyzing how markets work? I know we come across unintended consequences in these principles, but is there a disconnect there, or am I just missing something?
No, I think there's something of a disconnect. It's certainly the case that Hayek was heavily influenced by Adam Smith, and in many ways, Hayek is following in Smith's footsteps. What Hayek was interested in was how the forces of emergent order and the forces that underlie emergent order, how they work and how they apply in different spheres of human activity. And so he went deeply into it. Now, in a Principles of Economics class, you'll typically get a week on supply and demand, which is one interesting, but not the only interesting example of emergent order, of how prices steer resources. I'll just give one example of that I like to use, which is if you walk into we're in September now, school is starting around the world. If you walk into a store in the United States, if you walk into a Staples, which is a supply store for office supplies, and you ask for pencils, they have thousands and thousands of pencils, different kinds to choose from. What never happens is you ask for pencils at Staples or at Walmart or at your local drugstore, and they say, well, we're out. What do you mean you're out? Well, don't you know that over the last few years, hundreds of millions of Chinese have left the countryside and gone into the city? And as a result, a lot more Chinese children are going to school instead of working on the farm. And as a result, we've had to send a lot of pencils to China. So there aren't any more here for those of you in the United States. When we come back in 6 months or a year or 2 or 3 years, maybe we'll have some. Well, that never happened. So that's extraordinary. You don't appreciate it. You don't notice it. Hayek called it a marvel that markets work that way. It happens without a czar. There's no one in charge of pencils in the United States. There's no one in charge of graphite, the part of the inside of the pencil, or cedar, the wood of the pencil, or the synthetic materials that make up pencils now and sometimes. No one's in charge of those things, and yet the supply is always available, despite the fact there's been an extraordinary increase in the usage of pencils by the Chinese. And one more example I like is pizza. On Super Bowl Sunday, which is a very popular day for people to party in the United States, it's the single largest pizza day in the United States. More pizza is sold on Super Bowl Sunday when the football game is held than on any other day. And yet, you can walk into any bakery in the United States on Super Bowl Sunday and get anything you want. You can get a bagel or a pita or a rye bread or a scone or anything you want. They don't say, well, are you crazy? You can't have those. It's pizza. It's Super Bowl Sunday. We're out of those things because all the wheat, and grain, and dough and everything went to make pizza. Now, somehow it all works very smoothly without any central top-down coordination. And that phenomenon, how that works, the process by which it works, to me, is the most interesting part of economics, but it gets about a week in most Principles of Economics classes. When I used to teach economics, when I would teach micro, 40% of my class was on that phenomenon, supply and demand, and then all the different ways that supply and demand are affected by things like price controls or taxes or subsidies, and the effects of those changes in policy on consumers and suppliers. To me, that's the most interesting thing economics has to teach.
And they're fantastic and interesting examples as well, because when you actually think about it, they're wondering, well, with all the shortages of commodities around the world at particular points in time, say in the commodities markets and prices going up or prices going down, and, you know, why is it that in areas, say in developed countries, that we have and are able to meet this demand with the supply, but yet, and say, for example, I know back in 2008 or 9, Italians went on the street because the price of their bread or pasta have gone up. And in India, the government are cornering, in a way, cornering the market for rice in order to put it out onto the market or flood the market with the product, just in case these prices go up, and to help them maintain the access by those that are poor?
Well, there are two issues there. One is, how do you make sure there's plenty of stuff? And the second is, how do you make sure that certain people, say the poor, have access to it? You can see the consequences of bad policy in Venezuela right now, where people are starving, literally going hungry because of attempts by the government to keep the price of bread artificially low, bread and other things. There's rioting. There's people fighting over bread when it is available. There are people breaking into stores and bakeries in the middle of the night to steal bread. And it's just it's a breakdown of civil society when prices aren't allowed to work. It's a very interesting example. Actually, over the weekend, we had this tragedy in the United States, an explosion in New York City. And a lot of people, of course, didn't know. We still don't know the full story, but certainly at the time, people didn't know what was going on. They were scared. They wanted to get out of that neighborhood. A similar thing had happened in Sydney, Australia, in a terrorist attack sometime in recent months. I can't remember the exact date. But what that meant, because of that fact, that reality, that there were people who were scared, whether they were right or wrong to be scared, they had no idea whether there would be additional attacks, another bomb, how many people were involved. They wanted to get out of that neighborhood. So there are ways to get out of a neighborhood. You can walk. You can take your car if you have one. You can ride your bicycle if you have one. You can call a taxi. There are buses, public transportation of various kinds, subway in the case of a city like New York. So these are all ways to get from point A to point B. The other way to do it, of course, is now available in the last few years, which is ride sharing, called companies like Uber or Lyft that offer connections between people with cars and people who want to go somewhere. And Uber has a thing called surge pricing, where they raise the price that drivers receive and that customers pay when there is a heavy demand. And this offends people in this situation. There's a huge backlash against Uber for having surge pricing. And I'm not sure, there's some dispute about whether there actually was surge pricing in the neighborhood where the explosion was. There certainly was surge pricing outside the neighborhood, which is very standard on a New York City Saturday night. There are often a lot of more people who want to travel on a Saturday night for all kinds of reasons. They want to drink without having the danger of driving their own car, or they just want to get around and they don't have a car. So the demand for Uber is often higher on a Saturday night, which means that Uber raises the prices that they charge. Well, when it's because of a terrorist attack or an explosion or uncertainty, whatever it is, this offends people because they think that's wrong to take advantage of customers. And my response to that is there is some moral issue there. Perhaps it's wrong. I don't know. But what I do know is that there are more people who want to travel than in usual times. And if you want to help those people, you've got to have a mechanism to get the word out that those people want rides. And what's interesting about surge pricing is a way to do that. What surge pricing does is it tells drivers that they can make more money if they drive during this time period. So that encourages people to enter the streets with their cars, which is what you want, because you want people to get out. But the most important part is it encourages some people who otherwise might take a trip to say, maybe I shouldn't. Gee, it's awfully expensive. It's twice as expensive or 3 times as expensive as usual. So maybe I won't go to the grocery right now. I'll wait till it's back down lower. Maybe I won't go out for a drink. It's just too expensive to get there and back, which means that the cars are now freed up for the people who are desperately wanting to use them, the people who are scared, the people whose lives are at risk. We had no way of knowing. And so one of the issues that also arises in this setting is the question of poor people. Doesn't that mean that people with more money are going to have more access to the rides than people who don't? And sometimes that's true. That certainly is true on a typical Saturday night when people want to go drinking or partying. But in this case, if you think your life is at stake, we're talking about a relatively small amount of money. And my guess is anybody who was, quote, scared to death was happy to pay the extra $10 or $20 to find security that night. So I just think it's a fascinating example of the way prices steer resources, the way they send signals. The people who are going to go out for a drink who decide, I think I'll stay home. It's too expensive. They didn't know that there was an explosion in the Chelsea neighborhood. They don't have to know, because all they see is the higher price. And that was really Hayek's insight. And it goes all the way back to Adam Smith.
And Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand. And could this be something you mentioned, that people didn't have to know if an event occurred? All they know is that there's surge pricing. and there's maybe due to the time period that the market increases these prices due to the higher demands. Would that be an example of the invisible hand at work?
It would be. It's a perfect example of the invisible hand at work. It's just not the invisible hand that Adam Smith literally had in mind when he used the phrase, but it has come to mean, since Adam Smith gave us that phrase, it has come to mean the way resources and outcomes move around without conscious, deliberate, top-down planning or manipulation. So it's a very useful metaphor, but it's just interesting to note that Smith really used it. He only used it 3 times in his writings, and he once in a lecture notes, once in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and once in The Wealth of Nations. But it's such a great metaphor that it stuck. And Smith used it just to mean things that happen that aren't intended that turn out well. And this is one of those examples, in my opinion. But we as modern economists have used it to mean this full array of responses that we associate with emergent order and things that emerge rather than being designed from the top.
So if Adam Smith didn't mean it to be like that, how has economics changed, or what is your definition of economics? Now that you have the readings of Adam Smith, and possibly those beforehand and those after, and how you apply it today.
Well, economics is it's usually called a social science. The Nobel Prize in economics is the Nobel Prize in economic science. And I don't like that word. I don't think we should call ourselves a science. I think we're more of an art. And I think we're jealous of physics and chemistry and biology. We want to be like them. And I think that's a mistake. We do not have the precision that, say, physics and chemistry have. And even though we can use advanced mathematics and fancy statistics, but I think it's important to remember that for me, what economics is the application of some ways of thinking to help understand the complexity of the world around us. So that would be one way I would think about economics. Those key concepts are opportunity cost, the role of incentives, and then the kind of phenomena that we've been talking about, complex emergent order, what is sometimes called in economics market forces. The reason I don't always like that phrase market forces, it makes it sound like it has to do with the stock market or a farmer's market. And yet, to me, market forces is everything. It includes, for example, to take an extreme case, after a war, when a lot of men have died and the ratio between men and women has changed, men and women treat each other differently than they do when there isn't an imbalance between the ratio of the sexes. So that to me is a market force. It's the fact that the supply of men is down, and therefore the way men and women interact is going to be different. So market forces for me work in social ways. They work in all kinds of phenomena besides prices and besides the standard money prices, the standard ways we think of markets and economics. So one way for me to think about what economics is it's the study of these kind of emergent complex systems and how we interact in those systems, supply and demand just being one of them. Another nice definition of economics that I heard from a student of mine who got it from one of her professors, just unfortunately doesn't remember which one, but it was the idea of economics is the study of how to get the most out of life. It's the idea that we have limited time on this earth and we should use it wisely, and doing one thing means not being able to do another. And economics in many ways is the study of what those decisions imply for our outcomes, our well-being, and how we interact with each other when we make those decisions, whether it's in the marketplace for potatoes or whether it's in the marketplace for marriage in the case of the differences in the sex ratios. So to me, economics is a very broad thing. Certainly for Smith, he was interested in manufacturing, and he was interested in education. He was interested in sympathy, and he was interested in pride, and he was interested in what makes us tick, and he was interested in everything. And of course, I think a good economist should be interested in all those things as well, not just, say, the stock market or not just interest rates or unemployment, although those are important. And to me, all of it is part of human behavior in complex systems.
Russ, what you were just saying there, it really opened my eyes doing a podcast like this, and I'm sure you as well, in that the more guests you have, the more niche areas of economics that they tend to bring to us. And it's really up my eyes into identifying what you had just said there, that economics is everywhere. And they talked about happiness, sex ratios, etc. But you mentioned one thing there, that Adam Smith mentioned that economics is what makes us tick, T-I-C-K. And your book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, has opened up this whole philosophy around economics that Adam Smith had discussed in his theory of moral sentiments. And again, to be honest, it's really opened up my eyes. I have yet to read it, but I'm definitely going to read it very shortly. But it's really opened up my eyes that you can apply 18th century thinking in terms of human nature and human behavior to today, and I'm sure way into the future. And it's a philosophy that I think people would really appreciate if they sat down to read it.
Yeah, I think people misunderstand what economists are interested in, and that's partly our fault as economists. So if I said what makes people tick, I think most people would say that economists would answer money. That's what makes us tick. You want to understand why people do what they do. They do it for money because they're selfish. And Adam Smith would have been horrified by that, although sometimes he gets caricatured as believing that. Smith argued that what makes us tick is our desire for attention, respect, love, honor, pride. We want to be paid attention to. We want people to think highly of us. And so that's a theory of human behavior that's really is applicable today as it was in 1759 when Smith published that book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Certainly money matters. Certainly people do respond to financial and monetary incentives. When you raise the salary of a certain occupation, it will attract more people than otherwise would be in it if you hold other salaries constant. Offering a better benefits package will attract people into your company and into your industry, into a job. But Smith says that's not the only thing that matters. He said in fact that we're often mistakenly encouraged to feel that will make us happy. He said it usually doesn't. Money doesn't make us happy. What makes us happy is those deeper and more abiding sources of satisfaction, such as respect and friendship and love. And I think that's, in some ways it's a cliche. You can't really argue with it, but actually applying it as Smith does to a wide range of behavior, from how you behaved with your relatives, with your friends, with your coworkers, which is what I try to do in my book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. I think that's what makes it an interesting way to think about things. And, people who are offended, people who feel disrespected will do things that cost them money because they value the respect they receive more than they do. And when you start to think more than just the monetary effects. So when you think about just take one example, a really trivial, but I think it's a helpful one. When people go to buy and sell houses, they'll often use an agent, and they give the agent a reasonably large amount of money in the United States to interact with the buyer or seller on the other side of the transaction. And the obvious question is, why would you give them that money? What do they actually achieve? And agents will tell you they do all kinds of things. They can help you price the house correctly, and that's certainly true. They can help you stage the house, as it's called. They can help you get it ready so that people would like it when they walk through it, and that's true. But one of the things that agents do is they are an intermediary between you and the other side of the transaction. And that's very important, because when people feel that they have not been respected or that they're trying to be taken advantage of, they'll make decisions sometimes that give away money because they do not like having their pride hurt, or they don't like the idea of this person who they don't like living in their house. So often what we do with an agent is it's an arm's length way to put a little distance between ourselves and the other person we're transacting with when we know that our emotions are going to be involved. And that's a very powerful thing. So that's a simple example of how Smith's insight about behavior is relevant, but there are many, many more.
In your own book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life, you identified in a couple of chapters, and you break it down, the theory of moral sentiments, on how to know yourself, how to be happy, how not to fool yourself. And the question, I suppose, that many people would like to answer is there a secret to happiness? And I know you referred to money is not the path to it, in that, the futility of pursuing money is really, in order to find happiness, is quite hopeless. So what does he mean by how to be happy, and how can people take his or Smith's thinking to try to banish all the thoughts about your own consciousness on how people might perceive you?
Yeah, so there are many aspects of that, but the simplest way to think about it that I use in the book is I use a one-sentence summary of Smith, which is man naturally desires not only to be loved, but to be lovely. And by loved, he means not just romantically loved. He means paid attention to, honored, praised, respected. And lovely, he doesn't just mean it physically attractive. He means worthy of love, worthy of praise, praiseworthy, worthy of respect. So he's saying as human beings, we are hardwired to crave those things, to crave the respect of the people around us. And he says there's two ways to get them, that respect. He said there's two ways to get people to pay attention to you. One is to be rich, famous, and powerful, and that works like a charm. Certainly rich people get a lot of attention. Powerful people get a lot of attention. Famous people get a lot of attention. When a celebrity walks in the room, everybody turns toward them. They want to hear what they have to say. They look at what they wear. They get imitated. They get a huge amount of coverage and publicity. We all understand that. And Smith says, don't be fooled. That's the wrong. He says it works. And you have a natural tendency to pursue money, fame, and power because it will get you attention, respect, and love. But he said that's the wrong way to get there. He said the right way to get there is through wisdom and virtue. The right way to get there is to understand the world and to treat people well. He says if you do that, you're also going to be loved. You're also going to be respected. You're also going to be praised. But you won't be doing things along the way that people do when they want to be rich, powerful, and famous that are not so good for you and will ultimately lead to regret and shame and misbehavior. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. Smith wasn't making a general rule. He's not a fool, a totally general rule, but he understood that in our desire for, say, money, we can do some things that are immoral, that we are ashamed of, that we don't like to do. Not always, of course. Many, many ways to make money are very exemplary and lovely and good. But Smith says the temptation to do the unethical thing in pursuit of fame, power, and money is always there. And he was warning us. He's saying, not saying everybody does this. He's saying you should just be aware of it in your own soul, in your own consciousness. He also understands that we self-deceive, that we have trouble looking at ourselves as we really are. And we have a desire to see ourselves as lovely even when we aren't. So we don't look at ourselves so honestly. And Smith was very aware of that and warned us to be conscious of the fact that we are maybe not exactly who we think we are.
Being conscious of yourself, I'm not sure if this plays out in economic theory, because you might have a subconscious level that makes you do things, as you refer to there. It could be in your soul not to do something because it is unethical or immoral. So how do, say, some nations have different rules regarding how they treat people? And for example, in some countries, you could stone someone to death or lock someone up for life for a certain crime. And in another country, it's not a criminal offense or is a very minor crime. Where is this dogma at work in terms of religious beliefs that I'm not sure if economics takes this into consideration? And how can we do that?
Well, I think economics has something to say about it, particularly what Smith would have been interested in is the cultural norms of what's acceptable behavior or what isn't. I use the example in my book of, I heard the story, a friend was going to have a conference in Russia shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union. And a couple of weeks before the conference, he got a call from the hotel where he'd had the reservations, and the hotel told him that the hotel wasn't going to be able to give them as many rooms as they had promised. They were only going to give them half, something like that. And the guy said, what do you mean? He goes, well, I got a better offer. So I gave up half the rooms to this other opportunity. And the guy said, but we have a contract. And the hotel said, sue me. Now, in America, if Hilton or Hyatt or any of the chains, standard chains, hotel chains had a conference reservation that you had with them, I can't imagine them saying 2 weeks beforehand, oh, by the way, we got a better offer, we're changing it. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is simply we have a better legal system and the opportunity to sue them would be better and easier that threat would be more realistic. But the other reason is that people would just be ashamed to do that. It's just not nice. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Doesn't mean there aren't in our culture cases where people take advantage of other people. Of course, that happens. But there's also this conscience that people have that that's wrong and they wouldn't feel good about themselves. Now, it was a lot of money. Maybe they do it anyway. But in general, there's a certain self-regulatory aspect of that kind of what we would call malfeasance what I'd call opportunistic behavior that makes it less prevalent in some cultures than others. And that's just, how does that happen? And Smith was interested in that. He didn't write at length about it. Hayek was also interested in it, incidentally. But the culture around us, the norms, the expectations that we have of each other for how we behave and how we treat each other, those are all not designed. They're not rules. They're not laws or legislation that they're passed. It's just something that happens in some cultures, but not in others. One more example. In the United States, when you sell a house, it's a very complicated contract that goes along with the house of what stays and what doesn't to keep disagreements from arising or disappointment from arising. People want to be clear about what the expectations are. But no matter how detailed that contract is, it can't list everything. So there's some vague general things like the house has to be in decent shape or in working order or whatever those phrases are. And so, for example, if I leave my house, I move out and I leave a bunch of garbage in the basement, even because I was in a hurry or whatever it was, I didn't want to bother with it. And I said, I'll let the new owner deal with it. That's just against the rules. Those rules aren't written down anywhere. But that's going to really annoy the person I sold the house to. And I know that, and I don't really want to do that. So there's certain expectations that are set about how we behave. Same is true in driving in certain countries versus other countries. Certain behaviors are acceptable, certain behaviors are not. In the United States, the speed limit of 55 means you can go 63. It doesn't say 63 anywhere. But almost no policeman is going to give you a ticket for going 58 in a 55 mile an hour zone. There's a certain expectation that it's okay to go a little bit faster than that. So all these things are examples of norms that emerge in some cultures, but not in all cultures, about what's acceptable and what isn't. And they're a big part of what rules our daily life, and we don't think about them very much.
Adam Smith talked about this voice of reason, and he referred to it as the impartial spectator. Is this like a voice in our head to help us deal with, say, questions we have on our situations that we're currently going through, on how we approach things, how we deal with things, how we kind of keep ourselves on the good side or the right side of the law?
Well, Smith said that we act as if we have an impartial spectator watching us. This was his way of understanding where our conscience comes from. So if I have a chance to do something that's not so nice, and maybe no one's going to see it. Maybe I find a wallet with money in it, and I can just it's a deserted street. No one's around. No one's watching. It's dark. I can just take the cash out and go on my way. And would I do that? And Smith said, some people, of course, will. Others won't, though. Others will say, this is wrong. I'm going to make sure that the money and the whole wallet gets back to the person who lost it. And Smith says that when we're faced with those kind of ethical decisions, and not just a dramatic one, but there's thousands of these kind of decisions we make all the time in our lives. These are things like, it's a Sunday. I want to watch the football game, but I also should help my kid with his homework. Or maybe a friend of mine just lost a loved one and would love to have some time spent in comfort in conversation with me. So should I go do that or should I watch the football game? These kind of decisions all the time are being made in our lives. And Smith says we have in mind, when we try to decide what the right thing to do is, we have in mind the idea that someone is watching who's impartial, who's not me, not the person maybe who wants the comfort, but somebody just watching from the outside. And we use that impartial spectator imaginary. We imagine such a person to help us figure out what the right thing to do is. And now, of course, he says sometimes we don't want to listen to him, and we don't, because it's too much fun to watch the football game, or it's too much fun to do the thing that's keep the money, and we fail. In the excitement of the moment, he says, the impartial spectator gets very quiet sometimes, and only later do we reflect on the fact that we didn't maybe behave as nicely as we should. And we do that again through an impartial spectator, through this idea, this imaginary watcher of us. And so Smith was very interested in how that affected our ethical decision-making and our decision-making in general. Now, do people really behave that way? Sometimes. I think they do. Sometimes that might be a useful way to think about how they come to deal with such situations. But even if it's not what people do, he gives us a way, if we want to be ethical, if we want to do the right thing, it's a way to step outside ourselves and say, what would people think of me if they could know that this is the choice I'm making? If they know that when my child needs me to do the homework, I'm watching a football game? Now, right now, the only people know it are right here in my family. But what if who are partial? But what if somebody outside was watching? And it always fascinates me how, every once in a while I have to confess I've yelled at my children, and there have been times when I yelled at my children when I discovered in the middle of the yell that someone else was nearby and noticing. And boy, does that change everything. And so what Smith is saying is if you want to treat your children, of course, sometimes you need to yell at your children. I don't want to suggest you should never yell at your children, but a lot of times I regret having yelled at them. And so if you want to minimize that, he's saying just imagine there's someone else listening or watching.
It's amazing saying that, because when I was younger going to school, in order to make myself be attentive in class, listen, and not to misbehave, I always imagined that my mother would be looking outside through the glass, being a spectator, and she would never in her life had threatened anything like that at all. She would never said, I'll be looking in the window at you. And it just kept me in control. and I suppose it really worked, to be honest. And even though I knew she wouldn't be, I liked thinking that way because it helped me kind of concentrate and do the work. And I'm not sure if kids are fantastic philosophers, but if kids can articulate things like that, I think, and I'm sure they can in some ways or another, but how can we introduce this type of, not that type of thinking, but how can we introduce philosophy or philosophical thinking to kids if there's a way of doing that? I know schools may not have a curriculum, and I know you've mentioned in your book that you tried reading the theory of moral sentiments at the table to your wife and kids, and I don't think they batted an eyelid. I'm sure they did. I'm sure it got them eating their dinner. If you don't eat that dinner, I'm going to continue with the chapter.
Now, it's an interesting question of how we get our children to be ethical, and I'm not sure. I don't know how many parents want their children to be ethical. A lot of parents, I think, want their kids to be successful. They want their kids to be happy. Ethical, maybe not so much. So that's an interesting question in itself of how important should ethical training or philosophical thinking be used with children. Certainly schools struggle with this, and I think most schools just leave it alone. I think character.
They really do it through religion.
Yeah, well, religion does it. Certainly in religious schools, there's an emphasis on character, but I think in most public schools, they're uneasy teaching people character because it has certain religious overtones. So I think they leave it up to the parents, which is, maybe the right thing to do in a public school, but certainly in private schools and certainly in religious schools, there is an emphasis on ethics and character that can be very strong.
You've staged a play where you acted as Adam Smith, so you would have immersed yourself in Adam Smith's thinking and philosophical outlook on life. I'm taking the name of your book. How has Adam Smith changed your own life?
Well, it certainly changed my life because it got me to put a wig on to play him on off Broadway, which was a lot of fun. But for me, Smith, the way that Smith has helped me is to think about the way other people perceive me and the way I perceive other people, which is really, I think, what his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is mainly about. It's about a lot of things, but really what it's about ultimately is how we interact with each other face to face, not in markets, not in the anonymity of transactions on the internet or in a large retail chain or in a department store or at the mall, but rather how I interact with my friends, my coworkers, my family. And Smith sensitizes you to those interactions in a way that I found extremely fascinating and helpful. So in that sense, he changed my life. He also, of course, got me to think about my field, my discipline of economics a little bit differently, along with Hayek, to think about it less as an exercise in applied mathematics and more as an exercise in moral philosophy and in trying to just understand the world in different ways than just the simplification of mathematics. So those are probably the two ways that are most important.
Would you be for or against the mathematization of economics and more in favor of the methodology of the narrative that would have been part of the classics?
Yeah, I'm more of a classicist that way. I think narrative is storytelling is dangerous in that you can leave out things and you can hide sometimes through emotion what you're trying to get across. And I think good narrators know that. They take advantage of it and they should be open about it, I think, in most situations. But the danger of mathematics is that you give yourselves the illusion of precision in science, that you're doing something that's based in science when in fact you're not, and you're only fooling yourself that way. So both ways have challenges. Certainly, making economics more mathematical has allowed for us to find ways that maybe we fooled ourselves with our narratives, but at the same time we've lost something. So I'm we've gone way toward the mathematics part in the last 40 years or so. So I'm a big fan of pushing us a little bit back in that narrative direction.
Russ, is it okay if I talk briefly about how Smith had transitioned from his theory of moral sentiments? And before that, he actually wrote a book on astrology or astronomy.
Yes, astronomy.
Astronomy, yeah. And how he transitioned from all of that to his Wealth of Nations book.
Yeah, well, he didn't write a book on astronomy. He had lectures on astronomy that we have and that have been published. But there is a controversy in the history of ideas over the possibility that the Adam Smith who wrote the Theory of Moral Sentiments doesn't seem to be the same Adam Smith that wrote the Wealth of Nations. The reason is that in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he's writing about how money isn't everything. Money doesn't make you happy. The things that make you happy are respect and honor and pride and praise. And yet the Wealth of Nations is nothing about that. It's all about how nations get rich and how individuals prosper. And he seems to have forgotten everything he wrote about, or at least not think about all the things he wrote about in that other book. So philosophers and historians of ideas have been interested in how he could write those books, even though they seem to be somewhat in conflict. I don't see them in conflict. The way some people resolve it, I think the way I resolve it in my book is and I have a chapter on it, I talk about how in the case of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith is interested in our face-to-face interactions where certainly pride and praise and honor and respect come into play, whereas in more anonymous transactions in the marketplace, which is what the Wealth of Nations is more about, those issues are not as relevant, so he doesn't discuss them. So that's one way to resolve it. The way I like to think of it now, though, after having written the book and thought about some more and been influenced by some ideas of Vernon Smith, the Nobel laureate, who also is a fan of Adam Smith, is to think about harmony. So Smith was really interested in harmony. He was interested in how we managed to get along. He was interested in how our different demands for goods somehow lead to outcomes that we don't intend or design. And he was interested in the fact that we don't fight all the time over stuff. So that's the harmony of the marketplace. At the same time, there's the harmony of our personal interactions, how it is that when you want to talk, I have to make room for you. If you want to talk all the time and I want to talk all the time, we're not going to have much of a conversation. If you are going to be self-centered and your needs are going to be put first and I feel the same way, we're not going to have much of a friendship. If my wife and I are always trying to see who can get the most out of the marriage, we're not going to have much of a marriage. If we keep score over who did what chores all the time and throw that in the face of the other person, we're not going to have much love between us. So there is harmony in the personal sphere of our friendships and our marriages and in our work relationships one-on-one. And there's harmony in the larger sphere between nations and markets. And I think Smith was interested in both those things. What I learned from Vernon Smith is that reminded me that Adam Smith was alive, I think, for about 3 years when Isaac Newton was still alive. And Isaac Newton, he was interested in the harmony of the heavens. He was interested in how the planets got along. He was interested in gravity. He was interested in the motions of the planets. Smith was interested in the motion of human beings. He was interested in how we have harmony in our personal lives and in our national and economic financial lives. And so to me, Theory of Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations are just both part of that same picture and curiosity.
And it's such a significant time as well when the Wealth of Nations was first published. It was when the Declaration of Independence was actually written and signed.
Yep.
And I wonder, would the events leading up to that had changed his thought process or not even change his thought process, I'm incorrect by saying that, but have maybe somewhat matured into discussing what makes nations wealthy or rich. He was more of a mentor to a rich man's or someone in the aristocracy, his son, and traveled and would have met a lot of philosophers along the way at that earlier time, and maybe moved into academia or would he have been a tax collector toward the end?
So what happened was he started off as an academic. Then for a while he was the tutor of the son of the Duke of Buccleuch, which you were referring to.
Yes.
And at the end of his life, he did a strange thing. He was sort of a tax collector. He was a customs inspector, meaning he made sure that goods that were coming into Scotland were paying the right tariff and were not being smuggled in, say, in the dark of night to avoid tariff. And Smith was one of the great free traders. A lot of his book, The Wealth of Nations, was an attack on mercantilism, the idea that you need to mercantilists argue that we need to export and we shouldn't import. And Smith made fun of that idea. I think Smith was right. Exports are not the road to prosperity, and worrying about our trade balance is not shouldn't be something we worry about. That was Smith's argument, and I agree with him. So he was one of the great champions of trade without tariffs, trade with open borders. But in his time, he did work for the customs office. And I think part of that was, in his time, that was a major source of tax revenue. And without it, the government wouldn't have any money. There wasn't any other sources. A huge portion of revenue came from that. And so he viewed it, I suspect, as a necessary evil. And he certainly believed in the rule of law and thought people should keep the laws, whatever they were. And it was a good paying job. So I think he took it. And there's no sign that he felt he was doing anything, wrong. In fact, when he took the job, he wrote the Duke of Buccleuch and said, "I've got a new job now. The Duke of Buccleuch, after he worked with his son as a tutor, paid him a nice sum of money, and he kept paying him. And Smith said, "Well, I've now got this job. You don't have to pay me anymore." And the Duke of Buccleuch said, "No, that deal's permanent. Don't worry about it." They must have really liked him. But in the course, one other thing you mentioned, in the course of being that tutor, Smith toured Europe with the young man and got to meet a lot of the great philosophers and writers of France and other parts of Europe. And so that was good for Smith. But I think Smith's ideas on these things, they started percolating long before. And if anything, Smith had an influence, I think, on the Declaration of Independence rather than America's events influencing him. Certainly the founders in the United States were aware of the Wealth of Nations, and it affected their thinking and certainly affected the youth the first few years of the United States, if not longer.
Russ, can I ask you a number of questions, quick-fire questions, before we wrap up?
Sure.
If you could step into the DeLorean and time travel, I think we might know where this is going to go. And you could go to any particular era. What era would you go to? Who would you like to meet? And what would you like to say to that person, or what conversation would you think you'd have?
Well, it would be fun to sit and chat with Adam Smith, obviously. It'd be fun to talk to Hayek. I was alive when Hayek was alive, but I didn't know him, and we weren't. We both were at the University of Chicago, but not sure we were there at the same time. I don't think so. But anyway, I didn't meet him, so it would have been fun to meet him. I was lucky to spend some time with Milton Friedman. And so, those are my three economic heroes, probably Smith, Hayek, and Friedman. So, two of the three I would love to spend some time with. Are you interested outside of economics?
Well, yeah. I've always wanted, and not always wanted, but I always wondered, would somebody say something outside of economics? But there's no box there. Well, so if you're happy with
No, so I'm Jewish, so I'd like to see what really happened to Mount Sinai. I'd love to go back to see if there was the divine encounter that's captured in the Bible. That would be certainly an interesting experience for me. What really happened there? It's certainly an incredible influence on Western civilization, the Ten Commandments. It'd be interesting to find out what really happened.
Yeah. Also, if you have a book that you'd like to recommend to our listeners, and I'm going to put all of this on the show notes page, your own book and Adam Smith's book, what would it be?
Oh, there's a lot of books I love. I love Hayek's Fatal Conceit. It's not easy reading, but it's very short. I'm a big fan of Nassim Taleb's books. Fooled by Randomness, I don't think gets enough attention. That's actually my favorite of his. Other books, I like Hayek's collection of essays, Individualism and Economic Order. I think it's more accessible as a way to understand the ideas of Hayek. Those would be some of the ones I think of.
Yeah, I love Nassim's book, and I've integrated that into my own courses that I lecture, and it's a great way to deliver and make it known to people who would not typically have that exposure at an undergrad level.
Yeah, another book I'd mentioned is The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. It's an incredibly thought-provoking book. And recently I read But What If We're Wrong by Chuck Klisterman. Utterly fascinating. So, as you know, when you get to interview people, you find out about a lot of books you wouldn't have otherwise known. And know about, and that's it's great to keep learning.
You lectured in a number of universities, and George Mason would have been one. Do you have any criticism on the pedagogical approach to teaching in the economics discipline? Or does anything upset you in terms of the discipline, whether it's micro or macro, or how it's approached?
Well, if we're going to talk about macro, it'll probably take me we'd have to go for another hour, but certainly for micro, this is true of college. I think in general, it's not just a problem with economics, but there's too much emphasis on passing tests and exam questions and grading people and having to figure out who's at the top of the class and who's not. And I understand that's an important part of college, but it's very depressing to me. I really love understanding economics, and the best questions are not often going to be ones that have very open-ended answers, and those are very hard to grade. So those questions don't get asked on most exams. We tend to ask multiple choice questions or questions that are more straightforward. And I think that's the shame. I think that's we've lost a lot. The best economics is open-ended. The answers are, it's not the answers that count. It's the process of thinking that gets you to the answers that you're thinking about. And so for me, when I taught economics, I tried to emphasize the economic way of thinking and to teach people how to do that. And that's a very hard thing to test. And so it was a frustration of mine as a professor that a lot of the stuff I wanted to talk about and wanted to emphasize with my students made my life dramatically harder as the grading part of the experience. And I think that's true of most a lot of college disciplines. It's an emphasis on teaching actually a dumbed down version of the graduate level. So, I talk about this sometimes. I took astronomy in college, and I love the stars. There's so many marvelous, extraordinary things about the heavens. And yet I didn't learn many of those I've learned about those since I took that class from books I've read, not from the class, because the class was teaching a sort of a graduate level class, but dumbed down for freshmen. And, probably, 300 people in the class, maybe one would go on to graduate school, and the other 299 of us were going to become human beings, adults, parents, lovers. There were so many things about the stars to talk about and think about that are beautiful and wondrous and extraordinary, and yet we didn't talk about those because you can't ask good exam questions about them. So that's just a pet peeve of mine about the educational process, that I think it's a shame that by focusing on grading people, we tend to lose some of the more extraordinary parts of the human experience of education. And so I feel very strongly in my own discipline, but it's not just an economics problem.
I totally agree. And I love having those discussions, but you can only really have them when there's a small number in a class. And I'm sure this is something that has gone back in time of the Renaissance, and where you had individuals meeting up, and same with the Enlightenment period in Scotland. I'm sure they had these rooms or bars or taverns where, I don't want to call them academics, but say philosophers or artists, they would have all mingled and discussed and had proper debates and discussions that opened up your minds and insights and share your thinking process. And you'd learn a lot more, and it's quite effective. And we probably lost that through the industrialization of our schooling system.
Yeah, I still think a great college class can do that. A great professor can still do it, and they can do it in a big room and a small room. But certainly a small group can do that in ways that a large room can't. But I think there's still the potential for great education if we did it right.
Russ, on your website, EconTalk, and the EconLib website too, and also your own books, I'd love to know if you have any writing tips that you could share with us, and also your disciplined approach in getting work done.
Yeah, the single best advice for writing is to write every day. Now, I used to blog every day at Cafe Hayek. I've fallen out of the habit. I've got a lot of other projects going on, and EconTalk is a big use of my time now. So I'm trying to make EconTalk more valuable to listeners, more educational, and I want to offer more things to listeners who want to go deeper. So we're doing some interesting things at Medium, at the website Medium, putting up highlights of the conversation and embedding links for people who want to learn more. So I don't blog as much as I used to, which makes me a little bit sad. But writing is an art, and it takes practice. So if you want to be a good writer, start a blog. Just start writing every day. And the great trick to being a good writer is being a good editor. I learned that from Orson Scott Card. I had the opportunity talked to him once one-on-one about how to teach writing, because I was teaching economists at George Mason how to write about economics. And he said, grade them on how they edit each other, not on how well they write. And I think that's a tremendous insight, because it forces you, if you can become a good editor of other people, you can start to become a decent editor of your own work. Most people can't write a great first draft. So that editing process is hugely important to the process of writing. And so I would encourage people to practice their editing skills. They'll become better writers.
Russ, thank you so much for being so inspiring and for joining me on Economic Rockstar. I had a blast and I personally learned a lot from you. Share with our listeners again where they could find you. I
archive my work at russroberts.info. I'm on Twitter at EconTalker, EconTalker. My podcast, EconTalk, can be found on its own website, econtalk.org, but also at iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and elsewhere. And as I said, I've started writing at Medium if you want to follow me there.
Definitely. You can find all the links to Russ on economicrockstar.com/Russ Roberts. Russ, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. You are an economic rockstar.
Oh, you're very kind. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Russ.
If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now.